The morning sun had barely risen over the city when Officer David Thompson pulled into the courthouse parking lot. It was Tuesday, and Tuesdays were always busy. He'd been working courthouse security for almost 15 years now, and he knew the routine like the back of his hand. Lock the doors, check the metal detectors, and make sure nobody got in before the official opening time. Simple enough. David grabbed his coffee from the cup holder and made his way to the main entrance. The building was quiet, the kind of peaceful that only exists in the early hours before the chaos begins. He unlocked the heavy wooden doors and positioned himself at his usual spot, right at the entrance where he could see everyone coming and going. Around 7:30, a woman approached the steps. David noticed her immediately, not because she stood out, but because she was early. Way too early. She looked to be in her mid-30s, wearing dark jeans, a simple blazer, and carrying a leather bag over her shoulder. Her hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail, and she had the kind of tired look that came from not getting enough sleep the night before. "Excuse me," she said, reaching for the door handle. Her voice was polite, maybe a bit nervous. David stepped forward, blocking her path with an outstretched arm. "Court doesn't open until 9, ma'am. You'll need to wait out here." The woman paused, looking at him with a slight smile. "Actually, I need to get in now. I have to access the courtroom and prepare some things before the session starts." David had heard every excuse in the book over the years. People trying to sneak in early, witnesses hoping to get a good seat, even defendants trying to scope out the room before their hearing. He wasn't falling for any of it today. "Look," he said, his tone firming up, "I don't make the rules, I just follow them. The courthouse opens at 9 for the public. If you're a witness or something, you still need to wait until the official opening time. No exceptions." The woman shifted her bag to her other shoulder, and David could see she was trying to stay patient. "I understand, but I'm not part of the public in this case. I really do need to get inside. There's been some arrangement made." David let out a small sigh. This happened at least once a week. Someone thought they were special, thought the rules didn't apply to them. "Ma'am, with all due respect, everyone thinks they're special. I've got lawyers, witnesses, even family members of judges trying to get in early. Unless you've got a badge or you're a court employee, you wait outside like everyone else." "I appreciate that you're doing your job," she replied, and David noticed her jaw tighten just slightly. "But if you could just check with someone inside, or maybe let me make a phone call to the clerk's office, this could all be cleared up very quickly." Now David was getting annoyed. The coffee hadn't kicked in yet, and he didn't have the patience for this. "Ma'am, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know who belongs in this building and who doesn't, and right now you don't. So please step back and wait with everyone else when they arrive." The woman stared at him for a long moment. David could see something flash across her face, frustration maybe, or perhaps disappointment. But then she did something he didn't expect. She simply nodded, turned around, and walked back down the courthouse steps. "Thank you," David called after her, feeling satisfied that he'd handled the situation properly. He took a sip of his coffee and went back to his position by the door. The woman didn't leave, though. She walked over to a bench near the courthouse entrance and sat down, pulling out her phone. David watched her from his spot, making sure she wasn't going to try anything funny. She seemed to be making a phone call, speaking quietly into her phone. Probably calling someone to complain about the mean security guard, David thought to himself. Let her complain. He was just doing his job. A few minutes passed, then a few more. David checked his watch. Still over an hour before the doors officially opened. The woman remained on the bench, occasionally glancing up at the courthouse, but mostly focused on her phone. She seemed to be reading something, maybe emails or text messages. Around 8:15, a few lawyers started arriving. David recognized most of them. There was Mr. Patterson, the defense attorney who always wore those expensive suits. Mrs. Chen, the prosecutor who never smiled. A couple of younger attorneys he'd seen around but didn't know by name. He greeted each one, unlocking the door to let them pass through. They showed their credentials and he waved them in. Business as usual. The woman on the bench watched all of this, but she didn't move. She didn't try to follow the lawyers in or argue with David again. She just sat there waiting. David almost felt bad for a second. She seemed nice enough even if she'd been pushy about getting inside. Maybe she really did have some legitimate reason for being here so early. But rules were rules, and he'd bent them before only to get in trouble for it. Better safe than sorry. By 8:30, more people were arriving. Court staff members, clerks, a few bailiffs David knew from other courtrooms. Each one passed through security without issue. David was in his element now, chatting with familiar faces, making small talk about the weather and weekend plans. One of the clerks, an older woman named Janet, who'd worked at the courthouse for 30 years, came rushing up the steps looking flustered. She was carrying a stack of folders and nearly dropped them as she reached for the door. "Morning, Janet," David said cheerfully. "You're running late today." Janet barely looked at him. "Have you seen her?" she asked, slightly out of breath. "The new judge? She was supposed to be here by now. I've been calling her cell, but it went to voicemail." David felt his stomach do a small flip. "New judge?" "Yes, Judge Mitchell. Today's her first day. Youngest person ever appointed to the bench in this district. The governor himself was at her swearing-in ceremony last week." Janet fumbled with her folders, looking around frantically. "She's supposed to be in courtroom 3A this morning, and I have all these documents she needs to review before the session starts. If you see a woman in her 30s, professional looking, please direct her to my office immediately." David's mouth went dry. He turned slowly, looking toward the bench where the woman had been sitting. She was still there, now standing up and brushing off her jeans. She caught his eye and gave him the smallest, most knowing smile he'd ever seen. His 15 years of experience suddenly felt very, very insignificant. Janet rushed past him into the building, still muttering about schedules and first impressions. David stood frozen at his post, watching as the woman picked up her bag and started walking back toward the courthouse steps. His mind raced through the conversation they'd had earlier, every dismissive word he'd spoken, every assumption he'd made. She reached the steps and began climbing them slowly, deliberately. David wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, but his mouth wouldn't form the words. She passed right by him without saying a single word, and he could smell her perfume, something light and professional. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and David was left standing alone in the morning sun, his coffee now cold in his hand, wondering how badly he'd just messed up his career. Rachel Mitchell had known this day would come eventually. Not the part about being blocked from entering her own courthouse, that was a new experience. But the part where someone looked at her and decided she didn't belong, that part was familiar. As she sat on that bench outside the courthouse, phone in hand, she couldn't help but think about all the moments that had led her here. 20 years ago, she'd been a kid growing up in the east side of town, the kind of neighborhood where people didn't become judges. They became factory workers, retail managers, maybe nurses if they were lucky. Judges came from country clubs and law school legacies. At least, that's what everyone thought. Her father had worked at the steel mill for 30 years. Her mother cleaned houses on the weekends to help make ends meet. Rachel was the youngest of 4 kids, and she'd watched her older siblings struggle through life without much opportunity. Her brother Tommy had tried community college but dropped out to help with bills. Her sister Linda got married young and had kids before she turned 20. The other 2 found decent jobs, nothing glamorous but steady. Rachel had always been different, though. She'd been the kid who actually liked school, who stayed late in the library, who asked teachers if she could borrow books over the summer. Her high school guidance counselor had pulled her aside one day during her junior year and asked what she wanted to do with her life. Rachel had shrugged, not really knowing if she was allowed to want anything big. "What about college?" the counselor had asked. Rachel had laughed. Not a happy laugh, but the kind that came from knowing something was impossible. "My family can't afford that. Besides, people like me don't go to college." But the counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez, hadn't accepted that answer. She'd helped Rachel apply for scholarships, fill out financial aid forms, write essays until her hand cramped. And somehow, against all odds, Rachel had gotten into the state university with enough scholarship money to make it work. College had been hard. Not just the classes, though those were tough enough. It was the feeling of being an outsider. Her roommate had a car her parents bought her. Other students talked about summer vacations in Europe and internships their family connections had secured. Rachel worked 3 jobs. She waited tables at a diner on weekends, shelved books at the campus library during the week, and cleaned office buildings at night. She studied in the breaks between shifts, reading textbooks on the bus, writing papers during her lunch hour. People had looked at her funny back then, too. Professors sometimes seemed surprised when she spoke up in class with the right answer. Other students would ask her to explain things, then look shocked that the girl in the discount store clothes actually understood the material better than they did. Rachel had learned to ignore the looks, the assumptions, the quiet judgments. She focused on the work. Law school had been even harder. She'd gotten in on scholarships again, but the competition was fierce. Everyone was smart, everyone was driven, and most of them came from families where being a lawyer was just expected. Rachel stood out, and not always in good ways. She couldn't afford the fancy suits other students wore to mock trials. She didn't have connections for summer internships at prestigious firms. She studied harder than anyone else because she had to, because this was her one shot at a different life. During her second year, she'd taken a class on civil procedure with Judge Patricia Thornton, who taught as an adjunct professor. Judge Thornton was a legend, a woman who'd broken barriers herself decades earlier. After class one day, she'd asked Rachel to stay behind. "You're working too hard," Judge Thornton had said, and Rachel's heart had sunk, thinking she was about to be criticized. "I have to work hard," Rachel had replied defensively. "I don't have the advantages other students have." Judge Thornton had smiled. "I didn't say stop working hard. I said you're working too hard in the wrong direction. You're trying to become what you think a lawyer should be, trying to fit into their mold. But the legal system needs people like you. People who understand what it's like to struggle, who know what justice means to people who can't afford fancy attorneys." That conversation had changed everything. Judge Thornton had become her mentor, guiding her toward public service, toward a career that meant something beyond big paychecks and corner offices. After law school, Rachel had become a public defender. The pay was terrible, the hours were brutal, but she was good at it. She fought for people who reminded her of her family, people who'd made mistakes or gotten caught in bad situations and needed someone to believe in them. She'd spent 8 years as a public defender, then another 4 as a prosecutor. She wanted to see both sides, to understand how the system worked from every angle. Judge Thornton had pushed her to apply for a judgeship when the position opened up. Rachel had almost said no. She was only 34. Judges were supposed to be older, more established, more traditional. "The system needs to change," Judge Thornton had told her firmly. "It needs people who remember what it's like to be on the outside looking in. Apply for the position. The worst they can say is no. The worst they'd said was yes." The governor had called personally to offer her the appointment, talking about bringing fresh perspectives to the bench, about modernizing the judiciary, about representing the community. Rachel had cried after that phone call, thinking about her parents, about the guidance counselor who'd believed in her, about all the nights she'd fallen asleep with her head on a textbook. The swearing-in ceremony had been last week. Her whole family had come, even Tommy, who'd taken off work from the construction job he'd held for 15 years. Her dad had worn his only suit, the one he'd gotten married in 40 years ago. Her mom had cried through the whole thing. Rachel had stood there in her new judge's robe, her hand on a Bible promising to uphold justice and fairness, and she'd meant every single word. She'd spent the week after that setting up her chambers, meeting with clerks, reviewing case files for her first session. She'd been nervous, excited, terrified, and hopeful all at once. This was her chance to make a real difference, to be the kind of judge she'd wished existed when she was growing up. And then this morning had happened. She'd wanted to arrive early, to prepare, to make sure everything was perfect for her first day. She'd deliberately dressed casually because she'd planned to change into her robe once she got to chambers. She hadn't expected the formal entrance, hadn't thought about credentials or protocol. She just wanted to get inside and get ready. Officer Thompson's reaction hadn't surprised her, not really. She'd been judged her whole life for not looking the part, for not fitting the expected image. But it had stung a little bit, especially today. She'd worked so hard to get here, sacrificed so much, proved herself over and over again, and in under 2 minutes, a security guard had decided she didn't belong. As she sat on that bench watching other people get waved inside without question, Rachel had made a decision. She could make a scene, could pull rank, could march back there and demand respect, or she could wait, let the situation play out naturally and see what kind of lesson might come from it. The phone call to Janet had been brief. "I'm outside," she'd said simply. "There's been a mix-up. I'll be in shortly." Now as she walked back up those courthouse steps past the officer whose face had gone pale with recognition, Rachel felt strangely calm. Her first case as a judge was about to begin, and it seemed life had already given her the perfect reminder of why she'd chosen this path. Justice wasn't just about the law. It was about seeing people clearly, without assumptions, without prejudice. She pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside her courthouse, ready to begin. The courthouse hallways were starting to fill up with people by the time Rachel made it inside. Lawyers wheeling briefcases, defendants nervously checking paperwork, family members trying to figure out which courtroom they needed. The familiar smell of old wood and floor polish filled her nose as she walked past the security checkpoint, where Officer Thompson stood frozen, unable to meet her eyes. Janet practically ran down the hallway toward her, folders flying everywhere. "Judge Mitchell, I'm so sorry. I've been trying to reach you. We have everything ready in your chambers, but there are some last-minute motions that need your attention before court starts, and—" Rachel held up a gentle hand, smiling. "Janet, breathe. We have time. Let's go to chambers and take this one step at a time." They walked together down the corridor, Janet talking a mile a minute about the morning's docket, filing deadlines and which attorneys had already arrived. Rachel listened carefully, her mind shifting into work mode. Whatever had happened outside didn't matter anymore. She had a job to do. Her chambers were smaller than she'd expected but comfortable. Dark wooden bookshelves lined the walls, filled with law books and case reporters. A desk sat in the center, already stacked with files. Someone had put a small plant on the windowsill, a welcoming touch that made her smile. Behind the desk hung the robe she'd worn at her swearing-in ceremony, pressed and ready. "Your first case is at 9:15, Janet explained, laying out the files. "It's a preliminary hearing for a drug possession charge. Pretty straightforward. Then you have a motion to suppress evidence at 10, a bail hearing at 11, and 3 more cases this afternoon." Rachel nodded, picking up the first file. 23-year-old defendant, caught with pills during a traffic stop, public defender requesting reasonable bail. She read through the details carefully, making notes in the margins. This wasn't just paperwork. This was someone's life, someone's future hanging in the balance of decisions she would make today. At 9 sharp, there was a soft knock on her door. "Come in," Rachel called. A young man entered, maybe 25, wearing a suit that looked brand new. He had the nervous energy of someone fresh out of law school. "Judge Mitchell? I'm Kevin Park, the public defender on the Martinez case. I wanted to introduce myself before the hearing." Rachel stood and shook his hand. "Good to meet you, Kevin. First case in my courtroom?" He laughed nervously. "Is it that obvious? This is actually my first case, period. I passed the bar 3 months ago." She remembered that feeling, the terror and excitement mixed together. "You're going to do fine. Just be prepared, be respectful, and remember you're here to serve your client. That's all anyone can ask." Kevin seemed to relax a little. "Thank you, Your Honor, that helps." After he left, Rachel changed into her robe. The heavy black fabric settled on her shoulders like armor. She looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall. This was it. Everything she'd worked for, every late night studying, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt had led to this. She took a deep breath and headed toward courtroom 3A. The bailiff, an older man named Frank, who'd worked at the courthouse for 20 years, greeted her outside the courtroom door. "Ready, Judge?" "As ready as I'll ever be," she admitted. "You'll do great. We heard good things about you." He paused. "Also heard there was some confusion this morning at the entrance." "Thompson's pretty shaken up about it." Rachel glanced back down the hallway. "We'll address that later. Right now, I have cases to hear." Frank nodded and opened the door to the courtroom. Rachel could hear the murmur of conversation die down as people realized court was about to start. She waited behind the door, listening as Frank stepped to his position. "All rise." Frank's voice boomed through the courtroom. "The Honorable Court is now in session. Judge Rachel Mitchell presiding." This was the moment. Rachel had imagined it 1,000 times, but nothing prepared her for the reality of it. She walked through the door and into the courtroom, her eyes taking in everything at once. About 30 people sat in the gallery. Lawyers at their tables shuffling papers. A young man at the defendant's table who must be Martinez, his mother sitting in the front row behind him, clutching a tissue, and there near the back, standing at attention in his uniform, was Officer Thompson. His face had gone from pale to red, and even from across the room she could see the panic in his eyes. He'd clearly just realized where she was headed when he'd stopped her outside. Their eyes met for just a second, and she saw him swallow hard. Rachel climbed the steps to the bench, arranged her materials, and sat down. The high-backed leather chair felt strange, too big almost. like she was playing dress-up in someone else's clothes. But she settled into it, looked out over her courtroom, and felt something click into place. "Please be seated," she said, and everyone sat. Her voice sounded stronger than she felt, carrying through the room with an authority she didn't know she possessed. She looked down at the file in front of her, then back up at the people waiting for her to begin. "Good morning, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Judge Rachel Mitchell, and this is my first day on the bench. I want to start by saying what an honor it is to serve this community and to be entrusted with the responsibility of administering justice fairly and impartially." She paused, making eye contact with different people around the room. The nervous defendant, his worried mother, the young public defender, the prosecutor who was watching her carefully, probably sizing up the new judge, and yes, Officer Thompson in the back who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "Justice," Rachel continued, "isn't just about following the letter of the law. It's about seeing each person who comes before this court as a complete human being, with dignity and worth regardless of their circumstances. It's about checking our assumptions at the door and evaluating each case on its own merits. It's about fairness, compassion, and the understanding that we all deserve to be heard and respected." She could see a few people nodding. The young public defender was writing something down. Martinez's mother had stopped crying and was listening intently. "I come from a background that perhaps isn't typical for someone sitting on this bench," Rachel said, deciding in that moment to be honest. "I grew up working class. My family struggled financially. I worked my way through school and law school, and I've seen the justice system from multiple angles, as a public defender, as a prosecutor, and now as a judge. That perspective has taught me that everyone who walks through these doors deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, no matter who they are or what they look like." She let those words hang in the air for a moment. Officer Thompson had his eyes fixed on the floor now. "With that said, let's proceed with this morning's docket. Bailiff, please call the first case." Frank stepped forward. "The People versus Carlos Martinez, case number 2025 CR 4782. Kevin Park stood, helping his client rise from the defense table. The prosecutor, a woman named Williams who Rachel had worked with years ago, stood as well. Rachel reviewed the file one more time, then looked at the young man standing before her. Carlos Martinez looked terrified, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. "Mr. Martinez," Rachel said gently, "you're here today for a preliminary hearing regarding charges of possession of a controlled substance. Do you understand why you're here today?" "Yes, Your Honor," he said quietly. "Speak up, please, so everyone can hear you." "Yes, Your Honor," he repeated, louder this time. Rachel spent the next 40 minutes carefully reviewing the case. She asked questions, listened to arguments from both sides, reviewed the evidence that had been presented. Kevin did better than he probably thought he would, making solid points about the traffic stop and questioning whether there had been probable cause. The prosecutor argued her case professionally, laying out the facts as she saw them. When both sides had finished, Rachel took a moment before speaking. This was her first real decision from the bench, and she wanted to get it right. She thought about the law, about precedent, about fairness. She thought about that young man standing before her, about his mother in the gallery, about the community she served. "Based on the arguments presented today," Rachel began, "and after careful consideration of the evidence and relevant case law, I find that there is sufficient probable cause to proceed to trial. However, regarding the question of bail," she looked at Carlos, then at his mother, then down at the file that showed he had no prior criminal record, that he worked full-time at a warehouse, that he'd shown up for every court date so far. "Mr. Martinez, you have ties to this community, a job, and no history of missing court appearances. Bail is set at $5,000. If you can post that amount, you'll be released pending trial with standard conditions. Do you understand?" Carlos nodded, and his mother let out a small sob of relief. It wasn't an outrageous amount, something a working family might actually be able to manage. Kevin looked pleased with the result. "Next case," Rachel said, and they moved forward. She had 14 more cases to hear before lunch, and each one deserved her full attention. This was the work she'd trained for, the reason she'd fought so hard to get here, and she was going to make sure she did it right. The morning session moved faster than Rachel expected. Case after case, each one a small piece of someone's life story, each decision carrying weight she felt in her chest. A woman fighting for custody of her kids, A man accused of writing bad checks. A teenager caught shoplifting. By the time Frank called for the lunch recess at 12:30, Rachel's head was spinning with facts, laws, and faces. She returned to her chambers and closed the door, leaning against it for a moment. Her first morning as a judge was done, and she'd survived. More than survived, actually. She'd felt confident up there, in control. Like maybe she really did belong in that chair after all. Janet knocked and entered with a sandwich and bottled water. Thought you might be hungry. You did great out there, by the way. Everyone's talking about it. Talking about what? Rachel asked, suddenly worried. About how good you are. Fair but firm. That bail you set for Martinez was perfect. High enough to be serious, but not so high that his family can't manage it. And the way you handled the custody case, listening to both sides so carefully, nobody could say you played favorites. Janet set the food down on the desk. You're going to be one of the good ones, I can tell. Rachel felt a wave of relief. Thanks, Janet, that means a lot. After Janet left, Rachel ate her sandwich and tried to review the afternoon files, but her mind kept drifting back to the morning. To Officer Thompson standing in the back of the courtroom, looking like he wanted to sink through the floor. She'd seen him there the whole session, never sitting down, never leaving his post, but clearly uncomfortable. She knew she needed to address what had happened, but she wasn't sure how. Part of her was angry. She'd worked too hard and overcome too much to be dismissed like that, especially on her first day. But another part of her understood. She'd deliberately dressed casual, hadn't announced who she was, hadn't followed the usual protocol. And in Thompson's defense, he probably saw hundreds of people trying to get into the courthouse early for various reasons. He'd just been doing his job, even if he'd done it badly. Around 1:15, there was another knock on her door. Come in, she called, expecting Janet with the afternoon schedule. Instead, Officer Thompson stepped inside, his hat in his hands. He looked like he'd aged 10 years since that morning. Judge Mitchell, I'm sorry to interrupt your lunch break. I know you're busy, but I was wondering if I could speak with you for a moment. Rachel set down her pen and gestured to the chair across from her desk. Have a seat, Officer Thompson. He sat down stiffly, his uniform crisp and pressed, everything by the book except for the nervous energy radiating off him. Your Honor, I need to apologize for this morning. What I did was unprofessional and disrespectful, and there's no excuse for it. Rachel leaned back in her chair, studying him. He seemed genuinely sorry, not just worried about getting in trouble. Tell me what happened from your perspective. Thompson took a deep breath. I saw someone I didn't recognize trying to get in early. You were dressed casual, and I just assumed you were trying to bend the rules like a lot of people do. I didn't ask the right questions. I didn't listen when you tried to explain. I just made up my mind about who you were based on how you looked, and I was wrong. Completely wrong. Why do you think you did that? Rachel asked. He was quiet for a moment, really thinking about it. Honestly, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I guess I got comfortable. I thought I could look at someone and just know what they were about. I've seen so many lawyers in expensive suits, so many judges in formal clothes that I just expected everyone important to look a certain way. And when you didn't fit that picture, I dismissed you without giving you a fair chance. Rachel nodded slowly. You know what that's called, Officer Thompson? Prejudice, he said quietly. Yes. Whatever you want to call it, I know it was wrong. It's called making assumptions, Rachel said. And we all do it, probably more often than we'd like to admit. The difference is whether we recognize it and try to do better, or whether we keep making the same mistakes over and over. Thompson looked up at her, hope flickering across his face. I want to do better, Your Honor. This isn't who I want to be. I pride myself on treating people fairly, but today showed me I've got blind spots I didn't even know about. Rachel stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot below. She could see people coming and going, each one with their own story, their own struggles, their own reasons for being here. You want to know something? This isn't the first time someone's looked at me and decided I didn't belong somewhere. It's happened my whole life. In college, in law school, in courtrooms when I was a public defender. People see a young woman from the wrong side of town and they make assumptions. She turned back to face him. But here's what I learned. Getting angry about it doesn't change anything. Holding grudges doesn't help. What helps is using those moments to teach, to grow, to make things better for the next person who comes along. Thompson straightened up a little. So what happens now? I'll accept whatever disciplinary action you think is appropriate. I deserve it. Rachel came back to her desk and sat down. Here's what I think should happen. I think you should take some training on implicit bias. The courthouse offers it, I checked. I think you should really engage with it. Not just sit through it because you have to. And I think you should remember this feeling the next time someone walks up to that entrance who doesn't look like what you expect. That's it. Thompson looked surprised. You're not going to file a complaint or report me to my supervisor? Officer Thompson, I could do that. I could make a big deal out of this. Turn it into an official incident, maybe even cost you your job. But what would that accomplish? Would it make you a better person? Would it make the courthouse a better place? Rachel shook her head. I don't think so. I think people deserve a chance to learn from their mistakes, to grow, to become better versions of themselves. Thompson's eyes were getting red, and he blinked rapidly. I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't seem like enough. Thank you is fine. But you know what would be better? Actually changing. Taking this seriously? Because the next person you dismiss at that door might not be as understanding as I am. They might not have the power to walk away and let things work themselves out. They might just walk away feeling small and disrespected, and that's not okay. You're right, he said. You're absolutely right. Rachel pulled out a piece of paper and wrote something down, then handed it to him. This is the name of the person who runs the bias training program. Tell her I sent you and that you're interested in not just taking the basic course, but maybe helping develop better training for other courthouse personnel. If you really want to make this right, help make sure it doesn't happen to someone else. Thompson took the paper carefully like it was something precious. I'll do it. I promise. Good. And Officer Thompson, this conversation stays between us. Nobody else needs to know about what happened this morning unless you choose to tell them. I'm not interested in humiliating you or making an example of you. I'm interested in justice, and justice includes giving people the chance to do better. He stood up, putting his hat back on. Judge Mitchell, I want you to know something. I'm going to remember this day for the rest of my life. Not because I screwed up, though I'll remember that too, but because you showed me what real leadership looks like, what real justice looks like. You could have crushed me, and instead you're giving me a chance to be better. That's the kind of judge this courthouse needs. After he left, Rachel sat alone in her chambers for a few minutes. Her sandwich had gone cold, but she didn't care. She thought about her father at the steel mill, her mother cleaning houses, all the times people had underestimated them, looked down on them, dismissed them because of where they came from or how much money they had. She thought about how different her life might have been if someone hadn't given her a chance. If Mrs. Rodriguez hadn't pushed her to apply for college, if Judge Thornton hadn't taken her under her wing, everyone deserved a chance. That's what justice really meant. Not just following the rules blindly, but understanding that people were complicated, that they made mistakes, that they could grow and change if given the opportunity. There was another knock on her door. Come in, she called. Janet poked her head in. Ready for the afternoon session? We've got 4 more cases and one of them is pretty complex. Rachel smiled. Ready as I'll ever be. Let's do this. She gathered her files, straightened her robe, and headed back to the courtroom. There were more cases to hear, more decisions to make, more lives to impact. And she was going to make sure she did it with the same fairness and compassion she'd just shown Officer Thompson, not because it was easy, but because it was right. As she walked down the hallway, she passed Thompson at his post by the entrance. He stood a little straighter when he saw her, gave her a respectful nod. She nodded back. No words were needed. They both understood what had happened today, what had been learned, what would be different going forward. The afternoon session went smoothly. Rachel handled each case with care, listening to every argument, considering every angle, making decisions she could stand behind. By the time Frank called the final recess at 4:30, she was exhausted but satisfied. Her first day on the bench was almost over, and despite the rough start, it had turned out pretty well. She was gathering her things in chambers when her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. How was your first day, sweetheart? Rachel smiled and typed back. It was perfect, Mom. Absolutely perfect, and the strange thing was she meant it. Even with the morning's incident, or maybe because of it, the day had shown her exactly why she'd fought so hard to become a judge. Not just to make decisions from a bench, but to make a real difference in how people were treated, how justice was administered, how second chances were given. 3 months had passed since that first day, and the courthouse had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Rachel's courtroom had developed a reputation, the kind of reputation that spread quietly through the legal community. Lawyers started requesting to have their cases heard in front of her. People talked about how she actually listened, how she treated everyone with respect, how her decisions were fair even when they were tough. The story of what happened that first morning had gotten out, of course. In a courthouse, secrets don't stay secret for long. Someone had seen Officer Thompson leaving Rachel's chambers looking shaken. Someone else had noticed how carefully he started treating every single person who came through that entrance. Janet had mentioned something to another clerk, who'd mentioned it to someone else. And eventually the whole building knew that the new judge had been turned away on her first day. But the interesting thing was how the story changed as it spread. Some people expected Rachel to have come down hard on Thompson, to have made an example of him. When they learned she hadn't, when they heard about the private conversation and the second chance she'd given him, it said more about her character than any ruling from the bench ever could. Thompson had kept his promise. He'd not only taken the bias training, but had become one of its biggest advocates. He'd started leading sessions for new courthouse security personnel, telling them his story openly and honestly. "I thought I knew how to treat people fairly," he'd tell the new officers. "But I was wrong. I let my assumptions guide me instead of listening to what people were actually saying. Don't make my mistake." On a Tuesday morning in January, Rachel was reviewing case files when Janet knocked on her door. "You have a visitor," she said with an odd smile. "Says it's important." Rachel looked up, curious. "Who is it?" "Judge Patricia Thornton." Rachel practically jumped out of her chair. Her mentor rarely visited the courthouse anymore, having retired 2 years earlier. She rushed to straighten up her desk, then laughed at herself for acting like a nervous law student again. Judge Thornton walked in looking exactly as Rachel remembered, elegant and commanding even in casual clothes. "Rachel, dear, don't fuss. Your chambers look fine." She settled into the chair across from the desk. "Though I must say it's strange seeing you on this side of things. Seems like just yesterday you were in my civil procedure class, sitting in the back row and asking all those difficult questions." "It was 10 years ago," Rachel said, grinning, "but it feels like yesterday to me too." "I've been hearing things about you," Judge Thornton said. "Good things. They tell me you're changing the culture in this courthouse one case at a time." Rachel felt her cheeks warm. "I'm just trying to do the job right. The way you taught me?" "No, you're doing more than that. I heard about what happened on your first day. About Officer Thompson." Judge Thornton leaned forward. "Do you know what most judges would have done? They would have filed a formal complaint, pushed for disciplinary action, made sure everyone knew they wouldn't tolerate that kind of treatment, and they wouldn't have been wrong to do it." "But," Rachel asked, "but you chose a different path. You saw an opportunity to actually change something, to help someone grow rather than just punish them. That's wisdom, Rachel. That's the kind of thing you can't teach in law school." Judge Thornton smiled. "I'm proud of you." Those 4 words hit Rachel harder than she expected. She felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back quickly. "Thank you. That means everything to me." They talked for another hour, about cases and challenges, about the law and life. When Judge Thornton finally left, Rachel felt recharged, reminded of why she'd wanted this job in the first place. That afternoon, she had a full docket. The usual mix of cases, but one stood out. A young man named Deshaun Williams, 19 years old, caught with marijuana and facing a choice between jail time or a diversion program. His public defender was pushing for the program. The prosecutor was arguing he needed to face real consequences. Rachel read through the file carefully. First offense, high school graduate, working part-time at a grocery store, trying to help his mom with bills. It was a story she'd seen 100 times. A kid making one stupid choice that could derail his entire future. When Deshaun stood before her, she saw the fear in his eyes. The same fear she'd seen in Carlos Martinez on her first day. The same fear she'd felt herself years ago, wondering if she'd ever get a real chance. "Mr. Williams," Rachel said, "I've reviewed your case, and I've listened to both the prosecution and your attorney. Here's what I see. I see a young man who made a mistake. A serious mistake, yes, but one mistake. I also see someone who's been working, helping his family, trying to do right even when it's hard." Deshaun nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "The prosecution wants me to send you to jail for 90 days. They say you need to learn that actions have consequences. And they're not wrong." Actions do have consequences. But I also believe in second chances. I believe people can learn and grow and become better than their worst moment. Rachel looked at the prosecutor, then at the public defender, then back at Deshawn. I'm going to approve the diversion program. You're going to complete community service, attend counseling sessions, and stay out of trouble for 1 year. If you successfully complete the program, this charge will be dismissed. If you don't, you'll be right back here facing the original charges. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Deshawn said, his voice cracking. Thank you. I won't let you down. Don't thank me yet. Thank me by actually doing the work, by making better choices, by proving that you deserve this second chance. Rachel's voice softened. I believe you can do it, Mr. Williams. Now you need to believe it too. After he left, the public defender approached the bench. Judge Mitchell, can I say something off the record? Of course. That kid's going to remember this day for the rest of his life. The day a judge looked at him and saw potential instead of just another case number. Whatever happens from here, he's going to know someone believed in him. That matters more than you might think. Rachel nodded, thinking about all the people who'd believed in her over the years. Mrs. Rodriguez, Judge Thornton, even her parents who didn't fully understand what she did but supported her anyway. I know exactly how much it matters, she said quietly. That evening, as Rachel was packing up to leave, Officer Thompson stopped by her chambers. It had become a routine over the past few months. He'd check in once a week, update her on the training program, sometimes just chat about courthouse life. Big day tomorrow, he said. We're launching the new Bias Awareness Initiative for all courthouse staff. Mandatory training for everyone, from the janitors to the senior judges. That's amazing, David, Rachel said, using his first name like she'd started doing a month ago. They weren't exactly friends, but they'd developed a mutual respect that meant something. How do you feel about it? Nervous, he admitted. I'm giving the opening presentation, telling my story to about 200 people, but also proud, I guess. 3 months ago, I was just a guy doing his job on autopilot. Now I'm helping create real change. You should be proud. What you're doing matters. You took something painful and turned it into something positive. That takes courage. Thompson shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable with the praise. Judge Mitchell, can I ask you something? Why did you give me a second chance? You could have ended my career that day. You would have been justified. So why didn't you? Rachel thought about her answer carefully. Because I've spent my whole life being underestimated, being judged by people who didn't know my story. And I learned that anger and revenge don't fix anything. They just create more hurt. But compassion, giving people room to grow, that actually changes things. She smiled. Plus, I saw something in you that day. I saw someone who genuinely wanted to do better. How could I not give you that chance? I'm glad you did, Thompson said. You changed my life, you know. Not just my career, my actual life. I go home different now. I treat my wife better because I'm more aware of my assumptions. I listen to my teenage daughter instead of just reacting. I see people more clearly, all because you chose kindness when you could have chosen punishment. After he left, Rachel stood at her window, looking out at the city as the sun set. Somewhere out there, Deshawn Williams was probably telling his mother about getting accepted into the diversion program. Carlos Martinez might be at his warehouse job, making money for his bail and working toward his trial. Dozens of people she'd encountered in her courtroom over the past 3 months, each one carrying a small piece of the fairness and dignity she'd tried to show them. Her phone buzzed. A text from her father. Saw an article about you in the paper today. They called you a rising star in the judiciary. Your mother cried. We're so proud of you, sweetheart. Rachel smiled, tears forming in her own eyes. She texted back, I love you guys. None of this would be possible without you. The truth was, she'd been given so many chances in her life. Chances to prove herself, to rise above circumstances, to become more than what people expected. How could she sit on that bench and not extend the same grace to others? 6 months later, the courthouse held a ceremony honoring Officer Thompson for his work on the Bias Training Initiative. Rachel attended, sitting in the audience rather than on stage. As Thompson gave his speech, talking openly about his mistake and what he'd learned, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not because she'd been right, but because something good had come from a difficult moment. Thompson finished his speech and the room erupted in applause. As people started filing out, he made his way over to Rachel. None of this happens without you, he said simply. Sure it does, Rachel replied. You did the work. You made the change. I just opened the door. Well, thank you for opening it. As Rachel drove home that evening, she thought about justice, real justice. Not the kind that came from laws and precedents, though those mattered, but the kind that came from seeing people clearly, from understanding that everyone carried their own story, their own struggles, their own potential for growth. That first day at the courthouse, standing outside while Officer Thompson dismissed her, Rachel could have let anger and resentment guide her response. She could have wielded her new power like a weapon, proving that she wouldn't be disrespected, and nobody would have blamed her. But she'd chosen a different path. The harder path, maybe, but the one that actually created change. The one that turned a moment of bias into a learning experience. The one that proved justice wasn't just about punishment, but about growth, understanding, and second chances. And in doing so, she hadn't just changed one officer's perspective. She'd sent ripples through the entire courthouse, creating a culture where fairness and dignity mattered more than titles and appearances, where people were judged by their character and their actions, not by their clothes or their background. That night before bed, Rachel looked at the photo on her nightstand. Her swearing-in ceremony, her whole family gathered around her, all of them beaming with pride. She'd come so far from that little girl in the working-class neighborhood who didn't think people like her became judges. But more than that, she'd stayed true to who she was. She hadn't let power change her or make her forget where she came from. She'd taken the lessons learned from years of being underestimated and used them to create a courtroom where everyone, regardless of who they were, could expect to be treated with respect and fairness. That was the real victory. Not the title or the robe or the high-backed chair, but the knowledge that she was making a real difference. One case at a time, one person at a time, one second chance at a time. And it had all started with a simple choice. On a difficult morning, to choose compassion over anger and growth over punishment. Everything else had flowed from that single decision, proving that sometimes the most powerful thing a person with authority can do is show mercy to someone who doesn't deserve it. Because in the end, justice isn't just about giving people what they deserve. Sometimes it's about giving them what they need to become who they're meant to be.